Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I would like to address some of the very serious concerns posed by the nomination of Rex Tillerson for Secretary of State, along with several of President Trump's cabinet nominees. But first, I do want to briefly address what unfolded this weekend at airports across the country following President Trump's appalling and un-American ban on Muslims and refugees from entering the country. With the stroke of a pen, the Trump administration caused chaos and heartbreak for hundreds of families, many of whom are our friends, our neighbors, and our co-workers. On Saturday night, members of this Congress, including myself, were denied answers to even the most basic questions from border enforcement officers, questions that affect the people that we represent. And while I am glad that a federal judge quickly issued a stay and that the Department of Homeland Security has since provided further guidance on the executive order, many questions remain and too many lives hang in balance. I'm going to keep fighting as hard as I can, and I encourage everyone who's listening and watching right now to continue making their voices heard, because President Trump is already governing the way he campaigned by dividing our country and pushing extreme policies that hurt families across the country. Again, we saw this so clearly in the executive orders he signed this past week, but it's also something we have seen in the cabinet nominees he's put forward since his election. As we all remember, President Trump said he was going to, quote, drain the swamp. But he seems to think the way to do that is by filling it with even bigger swamp creatures. He said he was going to stand with the working class and fight Wall Street and big business. But he has nominated a cabinet full of Wall Street bankers and billionaires and millionaires and friends and insiders and campaign contributors. Mr. President, as many of my colleagues have discussed today, one clear example of President Trump's broken promise to drain the swamp is the nomination of Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil, for Secretary of State. This is a nominee who's not only a known friend and business partner to Russia, but someone who publicly spoke against sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine and Crimea. People in my home state of Washington have significant concerns about who he plans to work for, and so do I. Concerns that Mr. Tillerson failed to adequately address in his hearing. Now, as I've said before, reports of Russia meddling in our elections should disturb and outrage every American, Democrat, Republican, or Independent who believes that the integrity of our elections is fundamental to the strength of this democracy. And that is why it is so critical we have a Secretary of State who will stand up to protect those values. Mr. President, along with Rex Tillerson, I have serious concerns with the nominees that are going through our Senate Help Committee, as well as the vetting process that has taken place. My Republican colleagues rushed us into a hearing on President Trump's nominee for Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, for example. When we started the hearing, the Republican chairman, the senior senator from Tennessee, preemptively declared he would be limiting questions to just 5 minutes per member. A shocking and disappointing breach of committee tradition clearly intended to limit public scrutiny. And when the questions began, it quickly became clear why Republicans felt the need to protect her. Ms. DeVos refused to rule out slashing investments in or privatizing public schools. She was confused about the need for federal protections for students with disabilities. She argued that guns needed to be allowed in schools across the country to, quote, protect from grizzlies. And even though she was willing to say that President Trump's behavior towards women should be considered sexual assault, she would not commit to actually enforcing federal law, protecting women and girls in our schools. Now, I would say I was shocked at this candidate's lack of qualifications to serve, but at this point, you know what? Nothing surprises me when it comes to President Trump's new administration. Mr. President, as was the case with Ms. DeVos, Democrats were also unable to thoroughly question President Trump's nominee for Health and Human Services, Congressman Tom Price. Now, I can understand why Republicans wouldn't want Congressman Tom Price to defend his policies, which would take health care coverage away from families, voucherize Medicare, and undermine women's access to reproductive health services. Despite President Trump's promise to make health care better for patients and even provide, quote, insurance for everybody, but these are issues that families and communities do deserve to hear about, and they also deserve a thorough investigation into serious questions about whether Congressman Price had access to non-public information when he made certain medical stock trades while he was in the House. And lastly, Mr. President, I have to say I've grown increasingly concerned that President Trump's nominee for Secretary of Labor, Andrew Puzder, represents yet another broken promise of his to put workers first. On issue after issue, Andrew Puzder has made clear he will do what's best for big businesses, like his own, at the expense of workers and families. He has spoken out against a strong increase in the minimum wage. He's been one of the most vocal opponents of our efforts to update the rules so that millions more workers can earn their overtime pay. Puzder has even talked about replacing workers with robots because they, quote, never take a vacation, never show up late, there's never a slip or fall, or an age, sex, or race discrimination case. That's a quote from Puzder. And he has aggressively defended his company's offensive ads, leaving women across the country wondering whether he can be trusted in a role that is so critical to women's rights and safety in the workplace. Now, all of that makes a lot of sense coming from a millionaire CEO who profits off of squeezing his own workers. But it is very concerning coming from a potential Secretary of Labor, someone who should be standing up for our workers and making sure they get treated fairly rather than mistreated. So, Mr. President, now more than ever, people across the country want to know how the Trump administration will continue to impact their lives. And we Democrats consider it our job to stand up when President Trump tries to hurt the families that we represent. We are ready to stand with the families we represent to hold him and his administration accountable, and we refuse to back down and are prepared to fight back. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.